So whenever your project encounters an invalid scenario, so when you have some issue with either starting the project or in between you're handling the data and the data processing has an issue. So these kind of scenarios, we are going to call it as invalid scenarios, and we are going to see how we can go ahead and work on the invalid scenario correction. Okay. So invalid scenarios are something that you will be identifying in the start of your project itself. Okay. These are the scenarios that I might be requiring to go ahead and what should I say? Go ahead and uh, catch it as an invalid scenario, and then I should go ahead and say, okay, this is an invalid scenario, so for which I need to have a different ways of handling that particular code, so that, or that particular scenario, so that I'll be able to eradicate that scenario, or my bot will be saying, okay, this is the scenario, so for this particular scenario I need to go ahead and come in a different way, I need to process in a different way. So those type of scenarios is what we call it as invalid scenarios. So how are you going to identify your invalid scenarios? So invalid scenarios are certain things which will be coming into the picture as a normal manual scenario itself. When you're doing the manual operation itself, you will be able to, there will be the, you know, the subject matter expert or the product owner will be able to tell you, okay, these are the information that I might be having. So this information, if there's a wrong information that comes in, you need not process it, or these are the type of wrong information that might be coming in. And with respect to the application, you will be able to identify the invalid scenarios, like the login fails, or you're not able to work on the browser, or an application not opening. So those kind of scenarios you will be able to identify. So if you remember, in your SDD document, you will have the, not in your SDD document or in your PDD document, you will be having this particular scenarios identified in the beginning of the project itself. And later on, when you move and you are starting with the development phase and you're working with everything, you can go ahead and identify these scenarios, and you're going to go ahead and work on these scenarios, and see what could the robot do to come out of that invalid scenario. So this is how we do with respect to the error handling. So these are called exceptions, exceptional scenarios that occurs where the robot is not able to perform its activity. So we call it as exceptions, and these exceptions are nothing but it gives you either an error or an invalid situation, that the robot is stuck or that the robot is not able to proceed to the next stuff, right? So when I say invalid scenarios, so what are the kind of, or when I say exceptions, what are the kind of information that we are going to see? So the first information that we will be seeing is you're writing a code. So you have a flow chart. Okay, now so far what we were doing, we were having a flow chart and we were actually going ahead and writing the code, right? Sorry. And we were going ahead and writing the code. Now, when you're writing the code itself, if there's an error at one point, what happens here? The code gets stuck there, right? You will get a pop-up message and it will be, after that step, it will never proceed, right? If you have 10 steps and the fifth step, you're getting an error. After that particular, say, suppose your Excel is open, you're doing a read range and the Excel is open. So in those cases, what you're going to do, at that particular Excel read range itself, it will have an error and it will not proceed further. So you have to restart your program, right? So these are all the invalid scenarios that we see. If your Excel is not open, if the file is already used, and all those things. So how are we going to eradicate these particular scenarios? We cannot remove the errors, but we can handle the way that the robot can act when the errors encounter, when it encounters any errors. Okay, so we are going to use a couple of activities which will be part of the exception handling. The first activity, in every programming language, we are going to have try catch block. Okay, a try catch block is nothing but it will, your actual piece of coding is going to be written in, whatever you do is going to be written here, whatever you have already been writing is going to be written here. So this is your actual code. Okay, whenever there's an error that happens, so suppose your file is open, so whenever the second statement, which is a read range, there's an error, what actually happens is, whenever there's an error, you're going to catch that error. Okay, so once, why do you need to catch the error? So that you can handle that particular scenario. So what you do, in the try block, if there's an error, you go back straight to the, or the program will go back straight to the catch. So here you can actually see what kind of error. So when you catch, you have to segregate, right? Whether it is a problem with the website, problem with the notepad application, problem with the data, or whatever, right? So those kind of information is what we are going to segregate here and we are going to handle. So suppose if it is going to be your read range and there's an error, the file is open, you cannot do anything. You have to come here and it will say the file is open, please manually close the file, right? So at that time what you will do, you have to close the particular thing and you have to rerun the operation. So you'll manually close it and you'll go and rerun the particular project, correct? So this is what we are going to do. And what the catch block will actually, see, you will have n number of errors. Something will be like a browser not opening, one will be notepad application not opening, one will be data error, right? You're processing a data, there's some kind of a special character that comes in, you're not supposed to receive any special characters. So this is called data error, right? So there are different categories of the errors that might come. But if you say, I'm going to catch the error, I'm going to handle, you cannot handle all the errors in the same way, right? So what we are going to do is in the catch section, we will segregate the errors. We will say, okay, this is a data error. This is because the browser is not opening. This is because something is not opening. So you can segregate the errors here, and based on the errors, it will go to that particular block. Okay, so that is what we do in the try catch block. Okay, now there are two kind of issue. There are two kind of errors. Okay, so one error is called a system exception. When you say a system exception is going to be there, so in exception handling, we have two types of errors. You have something called a system exception. A system exception, or we call it as application exception. Okay. So what are these type of errors? These type of errors that is going to be coming when a application is not working, or when your system, the overall system, the system could be any system. It could be a browser, it could be a Windows application, it could be an Excel file, it could be anything, or it could be an SAP GUI or whatever. Okay. It is not working correctly, or it is not opening, or it is having some issue. So those kind of exceptions we call it as system or an application exception. Then we have something called a data exception, where you have invalid data coming in. So these kind of exceptions we call it as business exception. Okay, so what are these two actual errors? So whenever you have a data which comes in the invalid format, right? So you have, this is your data, right? So this particular data is going to be the data that you're going to process. So how can I say what is a system exception and what is a business exception? So that is what I'll do the explanation. Okay, so this is your data, and your system exception is going to be, or your application as an exception is going to be, all the information that you have written pertaining to your system or your application you're dealing with. Your read range, your write range, you are doing a for each, all those things will be based on the system architecture or the framework, whichever system you're connecting or whichever Excel you're connecting, all those things, right? So suppose you're doing a code like this. So there is a read range. You are trying to open Excel, you convert it into DT. Now you're writing for each row in DT, and you are taking row of vendor. Okay, and you're also taking somewhere, you're doing row of tax ID also. So let me put it as these two information is str underscore vendor. This is equal to str underscore tax ID, right? So assuming this is going to be both are string information, and you do an end for, if you do an end for, whatever is going to happen is it will just complete that particular operation, and it will continue with the, I'm doing an end for. Okay, so suddenly what happens is this particular information, this is how you have coded. So which means your code is actually expecting this particular information as well as this particular information, because it is using inside your particular project, right? So whenever a system exception could be, or an application exception could be with respect to your applications that you're handling. Okay, any applications, it could be SAP or a database or whatever. So that is one set of application exceptions, and another set is inside the application. Say suppose you're doing Excel handling inside the application, which means you're expecting the the row of vendor and the row of tax ID, which means you're expecting these two. Suddenly this particular information is not coming. Okay, so this is also going to be part of your system exceptions, because you have you have coded in a way that the framework or the structure is going to have vendor, tax ID, address, city, country. But if the tax ID is disappearing, which means the structure of the Excel sheet has disappeared. So that is also going to be part of your system exception. Okay. So whenever there is a change in the structure, then it is a system exception. Whenever there is a problem with the data, okay. Say suppose in this particular thing, you're having a kind of format. So this is a system exception, whatever, if you're not receiving a tax ID, or in case you are trying to use a tax ID and they give you a tax ID H. So all these are going to be system exceptions. Okay. Now when we are moving into data exception or a business exception, okay. So which means you are expecting in the format of only string. Now suddenly somebody gets you this particular number information. Okay. So which is actually incorrect. Okay. Which means you might not have any tax ID with the information that is coming here, right? So at that time you're going to have a invalid scenario. This particular data is incorrect, so you're not supposed to process it. Similarly, if they are saying is active, okay, there is another field called is active. Okay, which means the vendors are all active or not. So here what actually happens is, again I'm going to take an str underscore is active, right? So at this place you will be processing now. No business, I mean no data I mean no system exceptions will be coming in, so you will be processing the data. But there is a problem where you get, instead of, you are expecting only a y or a, but y or an n, but instead of n or a y you get some other data, which is you're not supposed to, you cannot handle this particular code, right? It will be checking whether it is equal to y or it is equal to n. You might have coded in that way only, right? But when you're getting an invalid data, so this is a scenario where we call it as business exception. When you are expecting some kind of a data, because your business will come and say this particular data you cannot do anything. Okay, business is sending you this particular data and there is wrong with the data, you will not be able to, you are going to talk about thousands of data, right? So when you have thousands of data, you won't be able to proceed with understanding what data is wrong. As a developer, we cannot take that responsibility. So what actually happens in this particular area, I will still be processing, but whenever I am saying I am not having a y or an n, if I have any other extra alphabets or any other extra data, that particular data is an invalid data for me. Okay, but I do not know how to handle, right? As a developer, I am not. If I am doing for SBI and the SBI sends me an invalid data like this, okay, I cannot take the responsibility. SBI has to take the responsibility as a client, right? So that is what we call it as business exception, where the business will be taking the action on those particular data issues, right? So this is what we call it as a business exception and a system exception. A system exception is basically on the architecture, on the structure of the Excel, or on the applications or whatever that you handle, that is going to be part of your system or an application exception. A business exception is going to be, you are not going to process the business exception. Okay, you cannot decide on the business exception. Always, irrespective of the programming language, usually business exception is something that the business needs to take care. Okay, invalid data. So we are not responsible for data handling. So these kind of scenarios only we call it as business exception. Okay, then right. So when I say business exception, so when you are doing handling of the data, if you are going to have a system exception, you won't be able to proceed with the operation. Okay, so which means you will not be able to continue to the next step or anything. So basically you won't be able to continue with the operation. So basically you will go ahead and you have to retry, or you have to do some kind of reinitialization, right? But in case of a business or a data information, uh, in case of a business exception, it will not stop there. Okay, you can start processing the next. So a business exception basically will occur in your data only, right? So if you have 10 data and if your fifth data is incorrect, you still have the library, you still have a feasibility to go and process the sixth data and until the 10th data. So you need not go and retry that data. Okay, so you can go ahead and proceed with taking that particular information as a business exception, and you can go ahead and proceed with the next set of data. Okay, but whenever a system or an application exception occurs, there is a possibility that you need to retry your particular information, or retry in the sense that there will be a retry mechanism that will be need to be written. Okay, so business exception, that will not be the case. You can go ahead, even after processing an invalid data, you can go ahead and process the next data. Okay, because it's not in your control, right? And similarly, when I'm going to talk about the activity, so what are the activities that is there to actually handle your particular scenarios or handle your particular exceptions? So we have a try catch activity. So this will be a try catch block. Then you have something called a throw. Then you have rethrow. And then you have terminate. Okay, so what are these informations going to do? So basically, when you're going to have a, say you're trying to process the data. Okay, so when you're trying to process the data, you will be writing your piece of code here, right? So any kind of invalid scenarios that comes in, we are going to categorize it as exception types. Okay, so you might be having a data exception, you might be having a browser not opening exception, you might be having a selector not found exception. Okay, so there are different types of exceptions that's available in the .NET scenario. So you can use the same exceptions, or you can also use the UiPath exceptions. Okay, you need not by heart all those things. You can simply go ahead and it comes with the project. So if you're working on a particular project, if your Excel is not opening, so by default you might be seeing the Excel is not opening, and there will be a pop-up which will come. That pop-up will actually show a exception model. Say suppose I'm trying to read a particular file. Okay, I'm doing a read range. So I'm trying to read the same file which is here, sheet 1. Right? So at this particular point, what is going to happen is this is actually going to throw me an error. Okay, in the catch block, there's no information. Okay, let me not put it as a try catch. Let's not use it as a try catch. Right? So what is the error? Okay, so I'm trying. So the file is already open. So let me just execute. So there is a problem, right? A runtime execution. So if you see in the particular information that you're getting in the pop-up, you have something called an exception type. So which means the file is already open and there is an exception type that occurs here. Whenever you have a particular pop-up, this is what it tells you. Okay, so there is a system exception that occurs. So whenever there is a system exception that occurs, you're going to have a system exception, means Excel is not available, which is a system exception. So there will be an exception type that will be coming into the picture. So if you see, there are a lot of exception types that will be coming. If it is related to a Excel operation, if it is related to a browser operation, if it is a selector operation, you will say a selector not found exception. Okay, fine. So whenever you have these kind of exceptions, so usually you have exception types, right? So when we are talking about exception types, there are so many exception types that is available. What you can do, you can go and verify that particular exception type and use it. Say suppose you are handling Excel data. So obviously if the Excel is not opening, you will be getting a system.io.exception. So this is your exception type that you will be getting. So system.io.io exception. So what we do is, in order to avoid this particular scenario, I'm going to use this particular block called try catch. Okay, so what I'll do is the same piece of coding only I'm going to write it here. Okay, I'm going to cut this. So I'm going to do the same piece of coding only, I'm going to write it. Okay, so here I'm going to do the same read range, right? In the catch block, what I will do is I have a list of exceptions that will be occurring. So I can choose between the exceptions. There are so many exceptions that you can choose from. Okay, so you can go ahead and choose your exceptions. Or if you do not know what type of exception, here I know it is a system.io exception. So I can go ahead and say it is a system.io.exception. So what will happen is whatever exception that occurs in your particular thing will be coming and sitting onto this particular variable. Okay, this particular box. right? So if at all you're going to have a system.exception which says file is not read or whatever, right? The file, whatever error message that we got. So somebody else is using this particular process, right? The process cannot access this particular file because it's been used by another process. So this is your exception, correct? So entire details that was there in your pop-up message will come and sit onto this particular word called exception. So this is the box which will actually hold the exception. From here, if you want to actually say, okay, this is the exception information, I don't want the user to actually see this message. I just want to say, okay, instead of, giving a rather, this exception is fine. Excel is open, so it is simple English. There might be exceptions where selector not found. The customer will not understand what is selector itself, right? So those kind of scenarios, what you can do is you can give a simple retranslate it to give a simple English statement. Or what you can do is you can put a message box here. So instead of saying the same error message, you can simply put Excel file open, please close manually. So this is one way of handling the exception. Okay, so where the customer will be aware, okay, this is the exception. So if that particular, so what will happen whenever this particular exception occurs, from this block it will directly go and catch that exception here, and it will see, okay, this exception type was IO exception, so I need to go to this IO exception, and it will immediately give a message to the user. So what they can do, they can close the file manually and they can restart the program. Okay, so this is one thing. Or if you don't want this, you can simply, you just want to say, there are certain exceptions where you need not want the user to take any action. Internet browser not opening, or Amazon website is not responding. Okay, the URL is not responding. That time user cannot do anything, right? So if the URL is not responding, you can put simply a log message it and log it inside your particular log file. Okay, so usually how we do is you put it as whether it is an error or whether it is a warning or whatever it is, you just simply put it as error, and you can say exception. This is the box that we had the data. So exception dot source will actually give you where the actual exception occurred. Okay, another concatenation exception dot, all these are related to exception information. Okay, you can see what are all the exceptions related information that you have. So if I give exception dot message, the same message that was displayed in the box will now be displayed here, or will now be logged here. Okay, say suppose here here I'm going to run the same program. Okay, I'm not getting that particular pop-up box which came before, right? So what happened, whenever there is an error that was thrown, it came to the catch block. The moment it came to the catch block, you're able to see this particular information that I have got is coming in a more appropriate manner, which the customer will be able to understand, right? So I'll go and say, okay, Excel file is open, please close manually, fine. So what will happen, this particular information gets logged here. So there is the information, the entire, so it is coming with the whatever is your source of the thing, and I don't know why it's saying ms corlib. Usually it will say read range. Okay, so read range, and the process cannot be accessed. Okay, so that is what we do in the exception handling. So suppose if you're okay, now we have handled the data. Okay, we have handled the Excel. Now you are doing something and the browser has crashed or some other system exception, but so far what did you do? Only if there is an IO exception you have handled. There is some other kind of exception or a selector not found exception. You can go ahead and select selector not found. So there is a selector not found exception. So whenever there is a selector not found exception, that particular information will be coming here. So instead of going here, it will come to this particular block. So like this, you can have any number of exceptions that you can do. Or if you do not know what kind of exception will occur itself, you do not know the subcategory. At that time, you simply go and say system.exception. So anything else other than the IO exception and selector not found exception will simply come to this particular block. Okay, so basically what are we doing? The actual code that we are going to write comes inside the catch, comes inside the try block, and then we go to the catch, categorizing it based on the type of the exception. So you go and categorize it inside system exception itself. You have a lot of subcategories, so you can either Google it and you can understand, or you know, you might be getting that particular error when you're not doing a try catch, you don't have an exception. When you're it'll actually throw you a pop-up, right? So that particular information you can actually see the exception type. So that exception type you can handle, and you can go ahead and use that particular information. So the most usual method is a log message. We'll be putting a log message, or you might be putting a message box to actually say whether it requires a user action. Means you might be putting a message box and you can say a rather simple English message. Okay, and then then you have the finally. So suppose you have a catch block, a try block, which executes the actual code, a catch block which will actually catch the exception and will handle the exception, and there is a finally block. A finally block is not going to be a mandatory field. Okay, a try block and a catch block is a mandatory field. A finally block is not mandatory. You may or may not have code inside this. Okay, so what do you actually do? What do you actually do in your finally block? If suppose, usually in your finally block, what you will do, you're into your Amazon website, you're doing something, Amazon website is not responding, or there is some kind of an issue. Okay, so what you will happen, you have to clear out, you have to log out. Say suppose the Acme website itself, there is some kind of exception that has occurred. Finally you have to log out, right? So you can write your logout functionality here, or you can put any kind of functionality that you need to close all applications, or whatever that you need to write, you can write the functionality here. Usually finally comes for that particular action. If you don't want to write anything also, it should be fine. Okay, so first it will be executing a try block. Once there is an error, it will go to the catch. If there is no error, it will directly go from try to the finally block. Okay, the finally block all times will be executed whether or not the code is there. Okay, certification question: how many times does a finally block will be executed? Every time. Whenever you have a try catch block, the try block will be executed every time. The finally block will be executed every time. The catch block will be executed only if there are exceptions, right? So we were talking about system exceptions. Now suppose we have a business exception. How are we going to handle? So suppose you are handling the data, and in the data you are having an issue. Okay, so how are we going to handle this particular stuff? We are going to create similar to this, we are going to create another information called business exception. So you click on new. So this is IO exception, this is selector not found exception. All the other system exceptions will come here. For a business exception, you simply go and say browse for types, business rule exception. Okay, now you have the same thing. So you have a business rule exception. Still all the exception block will come and sit into this, because anytime only one will be occurring, right? If you have a try, if there's an error, it will come to any one of the cases only, right? It will not come to all the cases. It will come any one of, if there's a business exception, then it will come to this block. So always we are loading it into a box called exception box only. So here also you can do the same thing. Whatever is your exception message, where it occurred, and you can continue it here. Okay, so this is what we do in a try catch block, right? So this is the simple understanding of your try catch block, whatever you do, right? Now let's get into a demo so that you will understand it more precisely. So let me delete this. Let me copy the same piece of code that we have written for the other program. Okay, rather than me, okay, let me quickly do it so that you also get it as a practice. So I'm going to go into Acme website. Let's do invoices for now. Invoices, there's too much of data. So I'm going to introduce a try catch block. Okay, so inside my try catch block only, I'm going to actually write the coding, right? So what actually happens is, if you need to invoke workflow, whatever you need to do, you can write it here. So I'm going to do an open browser. I'm going to do a straightforward method. I'm not doing invoke workflow and all. Okay, ideally you have to invoke workflow and everything, you have to do it here. I'm giving a delay just to enter the password and then a click action. Click on login. Okay, so here also I have, let me do it side by side. So I'm onto this particular page. So in my try catch block, now I'll go and click on vendors, search for, I'm not going to invoices because there's too much of data for the invoices and we need to do a lot of processing. So let me do it with just 10 data. So this is going to be invoices. So again, click on invoices, sorry, vendors, and then another click for search for vendors, F2, search for vendor, and now you are going to be in this particular box, then display all vendors. Okay, and then I'm trying to click on, I'll gather the information. Okay, so this is the data that I want to do a data scraping. So let me do a data scraping. So this is my open browser. Let me do a data scraping here. I'm extracting the entire data. So I have the data scraping. Let me copy this inside the try catch block. So this is my extract data table. So let me put it as flowchart. Okay, so my data table is extracted. What I want to do is I'm going to loop through the data. Okay, and I want the data that is going to be coming as France. Okay, my business comes back to me and say France is an invalid data, don't process France. Okay, you understand the requirement, right? So I have this particular data. When in this particular data they are saying France is an invalid data. Okay, so do not process anything that is pertaining to France. You are supposed to receive only Germany, other countries other than France. Okay, so let us see. This is an invalid data. System exception, you will know by default you can simply put a system.exception in the catch block and it will catch all the exceptions. But imagine when you're having a invalid data exception. So when you're having an invalid data exception, what will it do? It will need to capture that exception, right? It need to say that this is invalid data, this is an invalid scenario, so I'm going to catch it. So how am I going to catch it? So let me loop through all the data. So here I'm going to say these two data are going to be an invalid data, so I should not process it. Okay, so when I say I should not process it, I'm going to throw a business exception or a business rule exception, right? So how will I handle it in the code? So how am I going to handle it is I'm going to go ahead and, so this is your data scraping. I'm going to do a for each loop and process, right? So let me put a for each loop, a for each row. Okay, in extract data table. Okay, you're doing some processing. Now the business exception is if the data belongs to country France, you are not supposed, that is invalid data. So you can check that particular data. Okay, so if suppose the customer gives you an invalid data, the structure that is has come, then you can simply put an if block and you can go ahead. So in the if block, what you're going to do, you're going to put row of country dot toString is equal to France. Okay, if it is not equal, I mean, is not equal to France, then you go ahead and is not equal to France, then you go ahead and process it. So here what I will say, I will simply say right line. I'm doing the actual processing. It could be anything that you are doing. Okay, I'm just simply putting the tax ID. Okay, so what I put was something is throwing an error. Okay, so what I put is, if it is not equal to France, I mean, which is other than France, I need to process it properly, right? So I'm just saying the processing is, you could write n number of processes here. I'm just writing a simple right line just for the demo purpose, okay? But at this point, when it is equal to France, else section will be it is equal to France. You have to not process it, right? Which means you have to say it is a business rule exception. So how will you throw a business rule exception? A business rule exception is nothing but you create your own exceptions. There's no problem with the content, right? There's no problem with the application. The data is invalid, so you have to create your own exceptions. So how will you create your own exceptions? You're going to create your exceptions using throw. Okay. Okay, so when you say create an exception means you're going to throw a new exception. So whenever you say France is invalid, I hope you are understanding the difference, right? So when France is a valid data, other than France is a valid data, so I'm going into this particular block. When it is equal to France, which means it is going to the else block, which is a business exception, which is a business invalid data. So when I say a business invalid data I have received, I'm going to create an exception and say this is a business invalid data. So I will simply go and say throw. Okay, so now what happens in your throw? I'm going to say what is the, you're creating your new exception, right? If it was Excel not reading, automatically there was an exception which got created and it said process cannot is used by another process, but here you are creating the exception, right? So at that time you have to define your message for the exception. So you click on the throw and you go click here exception. Here you will be able to write new business rule exception followed by your exception message. Okay, so whatever that got created by default is what that will be coming from the application, right? Those comes under application exception. Whenever there's a data exception, you need to create your own exception. Okay, so when you create your exception, you need to give your own message. So here I'm going to say let me put this data as okay, let me not take this. So invalid data vendor from France, hence not processed. Okay, so this is my exception message. So I'm going to say this is the information that I have. I'm going to say this is the message I'm going to say whenever there is an invalid data. Okay, so what it is going to, and finally in the finally section, okay, there's a catch block. So here what I'm going to do is I have created the exception. So the moment I create an exception, there's a pop-up which will be coming. Correct? So without the catch block, I'm going to execute it without the catch block. So let me actually put a finally section. I'm going to log out. So let me do a click as well. Okay, so that it will automatically log out. Okay, I'm going to execute. There is nothing in the catch block. I hope there are no errors. So let me execute it. So it is opening the application. It is logging in. It is going to go to vendor, search for vendor and everything. Okay, so if you see there is a business rule exception, the pop-up message has come with the data that I have given. Invalid data, vendor from France, hence not processed. This is the exception that I created and hence it is throwing an error. Okay, so whenever you want to throw an error, whenever you want to create an error, you can go ahead and create. It is not that you can create only for business exceptions. You can create a new exception also as a system exception also you can throw. So you can use throw whenever you want to throw exceptions. Okay, whenever you want to create your own exceptions. If it is a business rule exception, you will give it as new business rule exception. If you want to create a system exception, by default, you know, there might be a file which is not available at that time, application will not know. So at that time, you can also simply go and say new exception followed by whatever message. This is also possible. Okay, you can create whenever you want to create your own exceptions, you will go and use throw, right? So I am using throw. Now I need to catch this exception. That pop-up was coming, right? I don't want the pop-up. Now when I need to catch the exception, I'm going to go ahead. The final thing, so this got logged out also. Okay, this did not get logged out. Why it did not get logged out is abruptly it stopped here. It did not come to the finally block itself. So let go and say, I am not bothering about what is the system exception. So generally I'm just going and giving system.exception. So here I can simply say right line, whatever is your exception. So you will say exception.source followed by exception.message. So whenever there's a problem with any of the, any of the Internet Explorer not working, or your login functionality is not working, something in the system, then it will come to this particular block. Now you have started a business exception. So if you want to have a business exception also, it should catch, right? So let's go and select business exception. So here also I'm going to do the same thing. So let us say exception.source and exception.message. Okay, now you see the code will be working in a better way. See, let me execute this particular code. We are catching the exception. There is no pop-up. What happened to the pop-up? We created the exception in the block. Okay, and it automatically came down to the catch, business rule exception, and we said in the business rule exception, we said invalid data, write it down. Okay, so it just did a right line and it stopped. So you had an invalid data, okay, but still it has stopped after processing row number 1. Okay, so which means the first data of France itself is here. Okay, so we identified, we processed this first data and we created a new exception, right? Now imagine I'm going to throw a business rule exception for Russia. Okay, so let us change the condition from France to Russia, because France is the first data, hence it is just stopping there. So let's imagine we are going to throw the information for Russia. Okay, now here instead of France we'll put it as Russia. So here if you see, it caught the exception and finally it came to the logout also. That also got executed. Okay, so hence it was logged out successfully. Now here, let me put a message which says, when I'm entering the, when I'm going to enter the for each block, here I'm going to say row of tax ID. It is just for which data we are processing. Okay. Right, just to see for what data we are processing, right? So I'm going to execute it. So if you see the same thing, I'm going to run. Right, so what happened was, our condition is for Russia, so it processed the first data. The second data it took and it stopped. Okay, which means it is not continuing for the third data and fourth data. But actually in the real time scenario, what actually happens is, you have to, whenever there's an invalid data, you should not stop at the invalid data. You are supposed to go ahead and process the next set of rows. Mark this as invalid data and then you should start processing the data. Okay, so which means if you create a throw, right, you have to make sure it will come directly to the catch block, which means the next set of information will not execute. It will be directly coming out of your, for here only we are creating a throw, here only we are creating a throw, directly it will come into the exception, a business rule exception catch block. Okay, so usually in business data exceptions we are not supposed to handle. So which means you are just going to process this, mark this as invalid data, process this, process this, process this, process this. So everything we are going to process. So whenever you want to process, even though there is a business invalid data and you want to process all the data, then you're going to do the same thing, but instead of writing this throw directly inside, you're going to put a try catch block here. Okay, and we are going to write the throw here. So what actually happens is, cut this throw, put it here, we are going to add it here, new business rule exception, and then we are going to write the same thing, right? So let me copy the same message. Okay, I'll tell you what is the difference. So we wrote our piece of coding. So this is your start. And then we did a try where you said you're going and login functionality you're doing. After the login, what are we doing? Going to the navigation. After the navigation, we are going and doing the data scrape. And after the data scrape, you're actually doing a if country is equal to Russia, right? So if it is, then it will come and whatever it needs to do, it needs to do. Then if it is going to be false, which is else, right? So what it will do, first time it will go, second time it is going to go, and the third time or the second time when there's an error, it will directly come from this block to the catch block, right? So here you're going to write catch, business rule exception, Russia, country, right? So for you to avoid this particular scenario, what I'm going to do is inside this particular block, I'm going to put another try catch and I'm going to say throw. So here before what we were doing, so instead of this, this is, we did the processing. Here we did the throw, right? So in this case, it will come down. In the other case, what we are going to do is, we are going to do the same thing. Instead of writing the throw directly, we are going to put a try catch. Right? In your try catch, you are going to put a throw. And here itself, you are going to catch. So what will happen? It will come inside, it will come to the else block. It is going to throw, but this throw, what will happen? Directly will come to the catch. Okay. So there is a for each. Here there was a for each, right? So I forgot the for each. Let me put the for each so that we will not have any problem. So there is a for each here. Okay, so what we are doing is, the difference is we're going to do the same thing. If it is Russia, it will go to the else. Here we are going to put another try catch to say do a throw, so directly it will come here. Okay, so after coming here, it is going, okay, we are inside the for each, so it will go and fetch the next data. Again, there's an exception, it will come here, it will record the exception. Again, it will start processing. So whenever you want to introduce or you don't want to stop the loop, when you have invalid data, then you have to introduce another try catch. Okay, because you're going to catch the exception here itself. So which means this exception is not required. Okay, you can catch only system exception, or you can catch any other invalid data or any other business rule exception. You need not process the, because this business rule exception will get processed here itself. So what I'll do is I created another try catch and I did another thing. So now if you see, I'm going to go and execute. It would have processed for all the data. Okay, so whenever you need to process, usually for data processing, we'll have the same method. Okay, whenever you're doing a for each, you will go ahead and put the another try catch to actually go ahead and process the data. So when you so it depends on where you want to actually create your error. So based on wherever you want to create your error, you go ahead and create your error accordingly. So now if you see, only for Russia, it said invalid data. All the rest of the data got processed successfully. Usually for business rule exceptions, we are going to do like this only. Okay. Now the same thing, there is another activity called rethrow. Okay. So there is a problem here. Okay. We are having a try catch, a first try catch. So we have a first try catch. Okay. And there's a second try catch. Okay. So here there is a throw, and I'm going to introduce another thing called rethrow. Okay, rethrow is basically used for developer purposes only. So here, instead of a business exception, I create a rethrow. So here I have a business exception. Okay, so here if I have the same business rule exception and I'm going to rethrow, now what will happen is it will throw. So an exception will be created. It will come back to the catch block and you are doing a rethrow. So which means from here, you're rethrowing the same exception. So again, when you're doing a rethrow, again an exception is created. Okay, so which means again it will come to the catch block. A rethrow is nothing but you already have an exception and you want to throw the same exception again at a different place. Okay, so I have an exception, Russia is invalid. So I am going to use the same message again to rethrow. So what will happen? I'm rethrowing the same exception. So from here, the condition will come back here. Okay, so if I'm putting business rule exception and I'm going to do a rethrow. Right? Rethrow will not have any messages. So rethrow, actually throw had some explanation that we had to write, right? Rethrow will not have anything. Whatever you threw there, it's going to be rethrown again. Okay, now see what the functionality is. I'm going to put it as main catch. Okay, so that we are able to understand what it is. I'm just changing it. Okay, so in the try catch, inside the second try catch, I have put a rethrow. Definitions will be different. If you read through the definitions, it's going to be difficult. Okay, you will not understand what is a throw and a rethrow. But usually the practical way how we do it is this is what we do. Usually for rethrow only people will get confused. What is rethrow? I'm not understanding. If you go refer by the UiPath terminology, we will not at all understand what is rethrow. Okay, so now what happened was the exception got created. I rethrew the exception, so it came back to the catch block, which means the same exception came out and it, so whenever you want to have a rethrow done, the rethrow will be actually from the main block or from whichever block, it will throw the exception again, which means it will create. See, in the catch block, if I'm throwing an exception, in the catch block itself, I'm throwing another exception. So obviously from here, it will come to the this catch. So it will say that here itself, I have got an error. So it will come to the main catch block. Okay, so rethrow basically is involved whenever you want to rethrow a particular exception. So you have an exception here, you are processing something and you want to rethrow it back again. So at that time, you're going to rethrow the exception and you're going to do it. Okay, and the last one is going to be terminate workflow. Terminate workflow again is going to be whenever you want to terminate the workflow. So the terminate workflow is when you have an exception and you just want to say on this particular exception, you just want to terminate the workflow. So when, you know, browser crashes, you want to terminate the workflow, or you're doing some kind of transaction and something gets cancelled. So you just go ahead and say on certain scenarios, you will just say terminate workflow, and you will say what is the reason terminated because of due to this particular reason, and it will just terminate the workflow and come outside. Okay, terminate workflow is going to be used whenever you want to stop the execution on certain errors. Okay, certain invalid scenarios you will be stopping it itself, right? So those kind of scenarios you are going to use a terminate workflow. Okay, it will simply stop it there, whether it is in the catch block or whether it is in the try block. If you put a terminate workflow, which means whenever you encounter Russia, you want to put a terminate workflow, the first time it encounters Russia, it will automatically terminate the workflow and it will come out.